Well, welcome back. Welcome back. I'm Brent Topp. I've been asked to be the moderator for this session, and we are thrilled to have you back, either virtually or those of you here in person. We're grateful to have you. Hope you had a nice break and a good lunch. Today, this session, we have got two really wonderful, eminent historians to talk to us. And so we have Jeff Walker and Alex Baugh. And so let me introduce them. And they're going to be talking about two very prominent people that are associated with the Council Bluffs and Winter Quarters area. Jeff Walker will be talking about Oliver Cowdery, and Alex Baugh will be talking about Ezra T. Benson, and we'll let them give you all the great details about that. Jeff Walker, although we view him as a historian, an eminent historian, is actually a lawyer and has been practicing law for more than 30 years, representing individuals and businesses in both litigation and transactional matters. He has significant experience in the areas of healthcare, technology, securities, antitrust, banking, real estate, manufacturing, and construction. He has represented clients in lawsuits before federal and state courts, administrative agencies, and in mediations and arbitrations. His corporate experience includes mergers and acquisitions, debt and equity financing, joint ventures and contracts for management, affiliation, licensing, and other commercial arrangements. Sounds like he could do just about anything for any of us. He has also served as general counsel for several clients in the healthcare, technology, real estate development, construction, and manufacturing industries. He handles all aspects of corporate organization and operations and management of litigation. Now, in his capacity today, we are really glad to have him because of his affiliation with Brigham Young University. He's an adjunct professor at J. Reuben Clark Law School at BYU and has taught classes in religious education at BYU. Dr. Alexander Baugh is a professor and past chair of the Department of Church History and Doctrine at Brigham Young University, where he has been a full-time faculty member since 1995. He received his bachelor's degree from Utah State and his master's and PhD degrees from Brigham Young University in history. He specializes in researching and writing about the Missouri period in early church history. He is the author, editor, or co-editor of 10 books, including three volumes of the document series in the Joseph Smith Papers. In addition, he has published more than 80 historical journal articles, essays, and book chapters. He is a member of the Mormon History Association and the John Whitmer Historical Association, having served as president of the latter organization from 2006 to 2007. He is also the past editor of Mormon Historical Studies and past co-director of research for the Brigham Young University Religious Studies Center. He is married to the former Susan Johnson, and they are the parents of 5 children. And he and his wife reside in Highland, Utah. And Alex has been my colleague for all of the years that he's been at BYU. And so we are pleased to hear virtually from Jeff Walker. And then after Jeff is done, Alex will present to you. And then we will have time for questions at the end. So we'll bring Jeff up onto the screen now.
Well, welcome. I appreciate the accommodations people have made to allow me to speak here from Salt Lake City. As many of you know, we've just finished Education Week, and I had obligations throughout the week to be there, and that prevents me to be with you in Iowa, which I desperately wish I was today. I'm going to share, can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to share my screen, and it's going to take just a second for us to put it together, but I think this should work. All right, can you all see that title page to my presentation, okay?
No slides yet.
How about, okay, well, let's try this a different way.
There we go.
All right, can you see that now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. There's so many things we could talk about Oliver Cowdery, and you know, my interest with him really started as a result of acknowledging that he is likely what we would refer to as the first true Mormon lawyer. And as such, I've had a personal interest in his life and his works and his involvement in the restoration, and certainly have worked closely before Richard Anderson's passing, who spent much part of his life working on the Oliver Cowdery papers. Today, I want to just kind of go through three things that may prove useful to you all. You know, we have seen this new picture of Oliver is somewhat different than this image that we've seen. Oliver was born in 1806, and in 2006, there was a big push to say, how are we going to celebrate his 200th birthday? We had just finished celebrating Joseph Smith's 200th birthday with symposiums and musicals and presentations. And when it came realizing that most of these founding fathers of our church were close in age and that their 200 birthdays were going to come up pretty quickly, there was an issue about what were we going to do to celebrate Oliver's 200th birthday. And in the end, while the church was a bit exhausted with all the work that they had done the previous year with Joseph Smith, it was decided that we would hold a symposium. And as we worked to decide what that symposium would look like, I really took the laboring oar to say, you know, let's look at the time that he was out of the church, practicing law, and see exactly what information we could dig up and understand more clearly about his practice as an attorney. And during that period of time, we always knew that we had this image of Oliver. It's an image, if you remember, and most of us know a lot of the story of Oliver's involvement with the church, but many of you don't know that he would have 6 children, only one of whom would actually grow to maturity, to adulthood, his daughter. And she would end up marrying a doctor. They would live in Missouri. They would not have any children. And so there are no direct descendants of Oliver Cowdery. However, this image, we learned that she had a daguerreotype and then a painting done hanging in her home in Missouri of this image. And in 1883, the church out west was very interested in putting together a presentation of the 3 witnesses. And while they were able to secure a relatively quick image of Martin Harris, you remember the one we all are used to, where he kind of looks angry and old, and also was relatively straightforward to get an image of David Whitmer, the second of the 3 witnesses. And he had had many photographs taken of him, and that was not a problem. But finding one of Oliver proved difficult. And after a significant amount of effort, they located this particular image of him from his daughter. And they received permission to take it to New York and have an etching done of it. And this is the image either from the etching that was done out of New York or paintings that were subsequently done of the etching to for us to know that when we see this image, we always associate it and know that this is Oliver Cowdery. Unfortunately, when the daguerreotype was returned to his daughter, in subsequent years, the house burned that she was in, and both the daguerreotype as well as the painting were lost. And so this kind of a subsequent of a subsequent image is all that we have had. However, as part of the 2006 celebration, we learned of a new image that a institute instructor out of Wyoming, Patrick Bishop, who had spent a lot of his advanced degree work in looking for images of founding members of the church, and in particular also looking at clothing that would be period, as we try to make sure we understand how we could date pictures based on the clothing. And he came across from the Library of Congress photographs this image there on the right. And it bore a striking resemblance to Oliver Cowdery. And as he did more research of trying to decide exactly what that image was and where it came from, it became clear that this could likely be a new front. Now it's tricky, right? It's tricky to know if it's Oliver, because in the one that we know is Oliver, it's just a 3/4 view. The one that we see now, the new one, it's a straight on view. So because the perspective is different, it's not as easy to compare the two. But as he started researching and understanding where this image came from, it probably was taken close to the same time that the first daguerreotype was taken. We learned that it was taken by a Black daguerreotypist who was working in Cincinnati during the same period of time that Oliver was working as an attorney in Tiffin, Ohio, which is just southwest from Kirtland. We know that Oliver was very active in politics in the Democratic Party, that he likely went to Cincinnati on many occasions, and that would not be uncommon or unheard of that he could have had this particular image taken. We also came to understand that the clothing he's wearing exactly fits what we would anticipate him wearing: a tightly tailored coat and trousers, fitted sleeves, oversized buttons, all things that point to a 1840s image. Well, with that done, it's pretty tricky to know. And for us in the lay, in this area, who are just lay people, to do the analysis, if you could draw lines and say, well, the eyes line up, and the nose lines up, and the mouth lines up, well, you can do that for most faces, to be honest. If you have Photoshop, you can make that most images, we have a certain proportion in our faces, and most of us have those similar proportions. So we got involved with Patrick in really trying to provide some expertise in determining whether this new image that was just out of coincidence discovered right on Oliver's 200th birthday was in fact possibly a new image of Oliver Cowdery. And to do that, we engaged two professional groups whose expertise were to determine historical photos if they matched other images that they knew of famous or well-known people. For example, there's been a lot of images out there of Abraham Lincoln. And of course, he changed how he looked over his life. And so to determine whether those are all actual images of Abraham Lincoln or not, there is a technology to do that. And so we first contracted with a group out of South Carolina who were experts in analyzing, in part, Abraham Lincoln images, a company called Covert Sciences. And they did a analysis of these two images, and they concluded that the features of the unidentified person on the right were highly consistent to the known images of Oliver Cowdery. Well, this seemed to give us some hope that we were on the right track. And we engaged a second group called Advanced Biometrics out of Vancouver, British Columbia, and they had a different technology that they were using. What they had was over 7,000 images of men in the 19th century for this particular analysis. And they would then put the two images, one known of Oliver Cowdery, and then one known as what we used to refer to as the unidentified man, in the mix of those 7,000 plus images. And through their analogs and their analysis, they could determine which ones would fall together as being closely resembling. And of those 7,000, these two images were matched together. And the conclusion of those experts were either these were the same person or twins. And they couldn't give us, we said, well, we'd like to know 100%. They said, well, we don't know 100%, but everything tells us that this is indeed the same Oliver Cowdery in both images. And consequently, we went ahead and had a painting done of this. Now you can see the only thing we've changed, and it would have changed our analysis, as we know, and we did actually change, we added one thing, as you can see in the painting. we added a Book of Mormon under his left elbow. Clearly, had that been in the daguerreotype, we wouldn't have had to do a lot of extra work. I had that put in because I think it's true that throughout Oliver's life, since his connection with Joseph Smith in 1829, he was connected to the book, and he could never unconnect himself from it. Well, after this painting was done and we started working on it about how it might be shown to the church, we had a woman who was an expert in 19th century clothing, Karma Anderson, look at it, and she made a radical conclusion to us. She said, she says, you guys have painted him wrong. And what she said was painted wrong is that he's not in a black suit. We said, well, come on, it's a daguerreotype. And these are only about 3 inches by 2 inches. These are little tiny images. And how can you tell? She goes, well, that's why you have to talk to me, because I'm an expert and you guys aren't. And she concluded that in fact, he was wearing a brown suit. And so we had the painting retouched up. Luckily, it was oil, so it could be retouched up at the same time, and putting him in this suit now that you see him wearing in the images that we have. Now, 2 other just notes that she found for us. One, that she found a stick pin you see in his shirt that we added. And then there was this leather strap that he was holding. And he was holding something in his hand. And we really struggled to figure out what could he be holding. At first, we thought maybe he was holding a pocket watch. And so we then looked really hard, because you see from the image that the bezel to that watch would be flat, not round. And we looked to see if there was any 19th century watches that could have been purchased that were square rather than round, and we just couldn't find any. We then thought maybe he was wearing eyeglasses, and maybe this was a pair of glasses. And we looked at everything we could find and could find no evidence that he ever wore glasses. I think what he's holding is, I think he's holding a cross. Now, I know in our Mormon culture today, we don't use the cross. But early on in the church, really up until the 1930s, 1940s, it was very common to have crosses be worn by women in the church. It was not a symbol. It's just not our symbol anymore. But I think Oliver Cowdery was always in his adult life a man of religion. So it would not surprise us if in fact he was holding a cross in his right hand. Well, this is the new image we have of him. If you ever want to see the original, it's quite a large original. It's now in the J. Reuben Clark Law School front lobby of their library. And so this is kind of a new way that we can see him and know him and have a new image. Just came to us for his 200th birthday, almost a gift from heaven. Well, if we talk a little bit about, I think most of us understand his critical, central role in the restoration. And all the seminal events of Joseph's life, Oliver was not just his second elder, but the second witness. He was the person who Joseph trusted and the Lord trusted with the seminal events of the restoration. What many people don't know is that he actually became active in being a lawyer. And this process of being a lawyer started relatively early. He, as we all know, he was a school teacher. He was a newspaper man, but he also had an interest in looking at the law. And this came in several times. As a matter of fact, if you remember, the very first day he ever met, the moments that he ever met Joseph Smith is when he traveled from Palmyra, where he was a school teacher, taking an assignment that his brother couldn't fulfill, and then met the Smith family and had the events that would lead him to Harmony to further investigate the restorational efforts that Joseph Smith was engaged in. And one of the very first things they did when they got there was to formalize the property arrangement that Joseph Smith was buying a series of acres from his father-in-law. And that deal had not been consummated in writing yet. And it looks to be the very first matter of business that Oliver took to when he arrived in Harmony was to get that bond or that indenture or that what we think today as a land contract, because the father-in-law Hales was carrying the terms. And if you can see down at the bottom here, you can see that Oliver Cowdery is the witness. Now, I will point out one little interesting little footnote that we don't completely understand about Oliver was that on a handful of occasions, he noted that his name was Oliver H.P. Cowdery. Do you see that on the document? Now, it's a curious situation. No one knows what H.P. stands for. He didn't always use it. Almost all the time, he never put it in. But there's a handful of times, like on this April 1829 deed, in which you see that he had put these initials in. Sometimes he just put H. In fact, it was so common knowledge that, and no one completely understood it, but knew that he did it, that when the Book of Mormon was published and his testimony as one of the 3 witnesses was included in the book, the middle initials, neither of those middle initials are noted. And actually, there are some commentary written in some of the magazines and newspapers of wondering what happened to Oliver's middle initials in the witness block of the Book of Mormon. But we knew early on that he had a mind for law. We know that during the Kirtland Safety Society, it's a funny thing when I got into working in church history years ago, and I've loved Alex Ball. We've worked together for years and years. And when I got first called to work on things, my wife was like, well, I think this is just a little hobby Jeff has. And then the hobby turned into kind of a passion. And that passion kind of turned into an obsession. And she was somewhat troubled, like, what's going on here? I thought you were a tax lawyer. And then you can imagine her glee when I got called by Marlon Jensen, then the church historian, to work on the Joseph Smith papers, which I had that assignment for over 14 years. 5 years of it, I was the assistant managing editor for the project. And I always wondered, how was my wife? Liz she was always worried about what was I doing. But in the end, there is true love, because this particular banknote, it's not worth a huge amount, but we do know that during the Kirtland Safety Society period, one of the options they had in trying to validate not getting a charter for the bank from the state of Ohio was to go get a controlling interest in an out-of-state bank and then have the Kirtland Safety Society merely be a branch of that out-of-state chartered bank. And they did effectuate that plan, and they targeted the Bank of Monroe, which they bought a controlling interest. Oliver then discontinued his association with all of the businesses in Ohio and moved to Monroe and became vice president and a director of the bank for about 3 months until we had the banking crisis, or the panic, what we call the Panic of 1837, in which virtually all the banks failed, including the Bank of Monroe. The reason why this note is important to me and interesting maybe to you all is that it is actually signed, if you can see there, it is signed by Oliver Cowdery. And there are very few of these notes that, of course, he would sign during his very short tenure. But he was also involved in these businesses, often in a legal capacity. At the same time, while he was in Kirtland, he became a justice of the peace. He was justice of the peace between June and September of 1837. He heard about 240 cases, some of them small, most of them small. He kept a very detailed docket book of those cases, not required by law. This was what commonly some justice of the peace kept their own private docket books, because justice of the peace or justice courts were not what we call courts of record, where they would be required by statute to maintain an official record of the proceedings. So these are all his own personal notes and his personal records of the cases. Some of them were small, some of them were large. His last case in September was a large case. It went on for 4 or 5 days, dozens of witnesses. And I think that exhausted him. And shortly thereafter, he moved to Missouri. And so he was clearly involved in the law and understanding. In those days, at Justice of the Peace, you did not need to be a barred lawyer to participate in them. Well, we know that he was somewhat, we could consider, the ranking general authority in Missouri. When he moved there, he had married David Whitmer's baby sister. He actually baptized her when she was 16 years old in 1830 in Fayette. He then married her in Kirtland in 1832 by Parley P. Pratt. But when the excommunication started, the purging of much of the Missouri leadership, as the complications of bringing the Ohio church and the Missouri church together, two separate leaderships, there became a very great conflict of leadership, of who had primal authority in certain areas. Now, today, that issue has been so fully resolved that it seems almost silly for us to think that it was a problem back in the 1830s and into the 1840s, but indeed it was. If you think about it, the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency was running Ohio. Joseph Smith being the president of the church there, and then the Quorum of the 12 being the council that would then implement the policies there. At the same time, in Missouri, you had a stake presidency with David Whitmer as the state president, and you had a high council. Now, you would think we all know today that certainly the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency have greater administrative authority than a stake president and a high council. However, doctrinally, it's not nearly as simple, because we know that the Quorum of the 12 are traveling high council, meaning they have jurisdiction, which we might refer to as general jurisdiction for the whole world. They go out to what in the scripture would note all the unorganized parts of the church, while a state presidency and a state high council, they have what we refer to in the law as specific jurisdiction. They only have authority over a specific organized portion of the church. The question is, at that time, did a high council that was traveling over unorganized also had authority over the organized? And that's where some of that conflict comes into play. Oliver is caught into that. There is a purging of much of the leadership of the Missouri church. Oliver is excommunicated. He does not appear at the excommunication. His argument, he submits somewhat of a terse letter. One would argue somewhat of a legal letter, but his basis is interesting. He first claims that the council had no authority over him, and he was probably doctrinally right. He was a then member of the First Presidency as an assistant president to Joseph Smith, and by theology and revelation, he could only be removed by the Quorum of the 12 and not by a stake high council. Now, that argument had some traction, I believe, in concept, but in practice, it really didn't work very well for him, because Joseph Smith was actually in attendance at his disciplinary council or court hearing at the time. And Joseph Smith had every right to interpret and implement the policies, and he sanctioned the excommunication. Now, we could go through and spend the whole time about why he was excommunicated, what were the issues, but clearly there were people who believed that he had lost confidence in the prophet and had certain, he believed, rights as an American citizen that could not be abrogated by any control that the church might want to oversee, especially land acquisitions and land ownerships stemming back all the way to independence and when the saints were driven from there. And so, but interesting enough, rather than attack the church, as many of those that were excommunicated, that would result in the Austin King hearing and the Mormon War in the fall of 38, result in the imprisonment of Joseph Smith and his colleagues for treason in Liberty Jail, and Parley B. Pratt and his colleagues for their participation in the Battle of Crooked River and for charges of murder, which were similarly unbailable in the Richmond jail. Oliver left. Oliver decided, rather than to further engage in the conflicts that were happening in Missouri internally. I mean, you have to think about it, friends. When you look at the liberty sections that Joseph received, much of those are very introspective. Rather than saying, you know, you've been persecuted, you're in the right, everyone else is in the wrong, it was often those sections as a way of looking inside the church of what they're doing to themselves. And this came because of the purging of leadership and the understanding of what does it mean to have authority and power in the church. And how do you manage that? Well, he moves back home to Kirtland, where his family was still living. His brother Lyman recruited him to come back home and said, if you had stayed home, you'd already been a lawyer, because Lyman had studied law and had actually been admitted to the Ohio bar. Oliver returns and he studies law with Benjamin Bissell, a prominent local Geauga County lawyer living in Kirtland, who actually he would have known well because the church retained Benjamin Bissell on multiple occasions to do this work. Well, we know that he then practices law, moves to Tiffin to practice further. I then had the opportunity in 2006 to go to Tiffin, found looking for his law practice, finding a courthouse that had been closed, being ready to be torn down, but a citizen suit had stopped it. And the result was that we had located about 2,300 pages of his law practice. Well, you can see his law practice is easy to find because that's what most of lawyers' handwriting looks like, and that's what Oliver's looks like. Well, the last thing, let's just spend a moment talking about him coming back. You know, it's a different issue about people coming back in these early days. I hope in the future it will be a different story about people coming back in our day. We need to make it easier. We need to make it more available, and we need to understand the difficult decisions some people often make as they exit the church. Oliver stayed close to the church. His stepsister had married Phineas Young, Brigham Young's brother. They were in many communications, Oliver, throughout his decade out of the church. But he finally came back. Well, just a note here, because I thought this was interesting. William Lang, one of Oliver's students who he mentored and became one of the most famous lawyers in Seneca County, wrote about the day that Oliver learned of Joseph's death. He writes, Joseph Smith was killed while Oliver Cowdery lived here. I will remember the effect upon his countenance when he read the news in my presence. He immediately took the paper over to his house to read to his wife. On his return to the office, we had a long conversation on the subject. And I was surprised to hear him speak so much kindness of a man that had so wronged him as Smith had. It elevated him greatly in my already high esteem and proved to me more than ever the nobility of his nature. And his nobility was shown of how he came back too. You can imagine it being a very difficult situation after Joseph's death. We have a crisis of succession of leadership. We have Brigham Young now leading this fragile claim of ownership of authority. The last thing they needed was to have a former member of the First Presidency come back into play. And what would he want? What position would he claim? What rights would he claim to have to the leadership of the church? Well, Phineas Young worked hard with his brother, trying to bring him back, and determined that he didn't have enough pull. So he enlisted the help of Orson Hyde. And Orson Hyde, through very kind and concerted efforts over the course of literally years, did finally have Oliver come to Council Bluff to meet with the church. And there in November of 1848, he talked about his return. And interesting, he talked it critically. If you read through he spoke in several meetings, that most of his effort was regarding his character. Why? Because as a lawyer, he understood that for him to be a credible witness, the sole surviving, like he would write, I know her needs, meaning the church, for I am her oldest member. If you remember, he was baptized first, and then Joseph second. And he knew that he had been there for the seminal moments from the visitations of angels, the restorations of priesthood, of keys, and that his witness as the sole surviving person who had personally witnessed these would be abrogated if his character wasn't exonerated, if he was made to be a liar, a forger, a thief, and some of the charges that were brought against him, which he thought were totally fictitious, if they weren't remedied, then what good would his witness be? And so bringing him back, he was concerned that people acknowledge that the charges that were brought, and those that often brought their charges had now left the church. So they were no longer in favor. You weren't protecting anyone any longer, he would write. And he would report, I feel that I can honorably return. I've sustained an honorable character before the world during my absence from you. This, though a so small matter with you, it is of vast importance. I've ever had the honor of the kingdom in view, and men are to be judged by the testimony given. He then went on to say, I have no desire for any position, any presidency, any calling. I only want to be with you again. And then he follows by saying, and I know I must return through the gate. I know the gate, meaning baptism. And I know that Orson Hyde has that authority, for I gave it to him. And if you remember, the three witnesses were the ones who selected the first quorum of the 12, in which Orson Hyde was one of them. So he was one of the people that had Oliver's hands placed on his head with the other two witnesses to ordain him to the apostleship. He understood that he had the authority, he had the priesthood, and so he was baptized. Unfortunately, as many as you know, he never made it west. He was struggling with tuberculosis. He would travel to David Whitmer's, his brother-in-law's home, I think in part to help and hope that David might return also, that they could travel west together. But the disease of tuberculosis would take him. And on March 3rd of 1850, he passed away at age 43. His testimony intact, his covenants intact. And for me, I love Oliver Cowdery type of people. I like people who are not perfect. I like people who have made mistakes like I have, who've had to come back to things that are most important, which most of us have had to do. I bear you my testimony that I believe that Oliver Cowdery, if in heaven, you and I are ever at a conference, seated in the congregation, and Oliver Cowdery comes through the back doors, that all of us will stand and will watch as he walks to the front, steps onto the stage, and is embraced by the great ones of the world and takes his place rightly among them. And I bear you that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. I've loaded here a few other readings that I've written on this topic. If any of you have any interest of looking further, I think I've taken more than my fair time. Alex, I apologize.
Hold on. We'll do the questions at the end. Okay, after he does.
Thank you, Jeff. Wonderful presentation. I'm grateful for his friendship and the many years we've worked together on various things. And again, I know of Jeff Walker's passion for the life and mission of Oliver Cowdery.